That money that comes in will not be going to my district to fix anything. Maybe 10% will go to Republican districts. I guarantee you that. This will be a huge slush fund for the Democrat side of the aisle, just like the budget is. For months at a time, we sit here on our butts while the Democrats, while you go into conference and figure out a way to divide up $250 billion. No one invites us up. No one says, what do we need for our district? At the end of the year, when I get a $25,000 or $50,000 grant, I'm supposed to say, thank you very much, while other sides of the aisle get $6 million, $8 million, because their 135,000 people are more important than my 135,000 people. They're so much better than my people.
I've also declared war on potholes, so here's the first shot across the bow.
Well, as you know, with Planet Albany, there's always something that makes the planet turn.
And it's this amazing view of D.C., and Eddie Vedder comes out. And he goes, you have a cigarette? And I've never smoked in my life, but if I had, I wish that was the moment.
And this strategy takes us from potholes to knotholes.
I would like to say it was a pleasure, Mr. Kim. But I'm on the road.
I'm David Lombardo, and this is Dispatches from Planet Albany, a WCNY podcast about power and politics in New York. On today's episode, we're going to examine what is probably the biggest substantive issue right now in New York, the wildcat strike by prison guards around New York, as well as violence in our prison system, and consider more of the underlying political and social currents that are driving this story and will likely shape how it gets resolved, when and if it does. To do that, we're joined on Dispatches by Chris Gelardi, a New York Focus reporter who has reported extensively on the state prison system, including a recent examination on the leader of the state prison system and how ingrained his family is in this institution. So, Chris, from my outside perspective, and please tell me if I'm wrong, it seems like the start of the strike by the prison guards basically coincided with criminal charges being brought against the guards who allegedly murdered Robert Brooks at a central New York prison. So if you do agree that this was, say, the final straw, what were the conditions that got us to this point? Or maybe sticking with that analogy, what were all the other straws that were put on the camel's back, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. So, this hasn't been part of either like the unions or corrections officers' like official line, but yeah, you're absolutely correct. The strike started around right when charges were handed down for some of the officers allegedly involved in the killing of Robert Brooks. Since that happened in December and video came out sort of at the end of December, the entire prison system has really been under very intense scrutiny, more scrutiny than it usually gets. I was actually at a hearing shortly before the strike started. It was just like annual budget hearing, right. And the head of prison system, Dan Marticello, his portion of the hearing went for a good 3 hours, and a lot of it, like a good portion of it, was just legislators grilling him over this killing and what it represents and questioning how systemic it actually is, since, is the only time something like this has been caught on video. So I do think that's a huge part of it, even though that's not what the corrections officers have been talking about. The other sort of things that have been sort of building up to this, one is a sort of peculiar situation of understaffing in New York's prisons. The New York prison system is really strange in that it actually, like just on paper, in terms of ratios, has tied for the highest ratio of like security staff, like corrections officers, to incarcerated people in the country. But there is still an issue of understaffing for certain shifts. That's for a number of reasons. There's, small reasons, like there's a lot of workers' compensation abuse. So a lot of officers aren't showing up for work. The Inspector General has done really good investigations and reporting on docs workers' comp abuse. But there's also this peculiar thing where, we had the era of mass incarceration in the 80s and 90s, and the prison population boomed. And New York built a lot of prisons during that time. And then there were a lot of reforms, a lot of sentencing reforms, changes in policing. The prison population has really declined. I think it's halved since like 2000. So if you have a lot more prisons and a lot fewer incarcerated people, that actually like messes up the ratios. So you need a lot more staff, like per incarcerated person. And we've been seeing the prison system try to address this in a number of ways. One is through prison closures. Cuomo closed a bunch of prisons. Just last year, they closed 2 more. Corrections officers still complain because of that, like, staffing issue. They're forced to work a lot of double shifts. Some of them are saying they're working triple shifts. There's also, an issue recruiting. This is just like a law enforcement thing across the country and every sort of aspect. It's hard to get new recruits. So understaffing is another thread. And then the other main one is, I'm sure a lot of people have heard of it, HALT, which is the solitary confinement reform law that went into effect in 2022. It was a very big overarching law. It really sort of fundamentally altered not only just like the practice of solitary confinement, but really the discipline regime in the prison system. Put a lot of restrictions on who you could send to solitary confinement, how long you can send them there. If you want to send people in isolation for longer, they have to be in these different kind of units that have even like stricter treatment standards. It also put in place a process by which if an incarcerated person is like accused of a disciplinary infraction, they must go through like a hearing process before they're sent to solitary.
Yeah, and that part that
Yeah.
you just mentioned, even with the limited implementation of HALT, that last aspect that you highlighted is something that you seem to attribute to altering the balance of power in the state prisons. And I'm curious, from your perspective, is this strike largely about restoring that power dynamic with either the repeal or additional restrictions to HALT, or are prison guards genuinely concerned about safety issues that they've raised following the limited implementation of HALT, concerns that may or may not be valid?
Sure, that's a beautiful question. That's a great way to put it. I think it's both. I think it is about safety. I'll put up front that I have questions about these numbers because they're self-reported, but per the self-reported numbers, there's been a large like a spike in assaults on staff in the prisons.
Yeah, how serious do you take those numbers? Because we had Senator Salazar on the show recently, and one of the things she pointed out to us, and maybe this is not the way it actually is, that the definition of what counts as an assault on a prison guard by an incarcerated New Yorker is so broad that it can include someone just not obeying an order.
I mean, I would echo what she said. One, the definition is very broad and there are different levels to it. One that I see a lot actually is like an incarcerated person like splashes something like a liquid on like a staff member. That can count as an assault on staff. So it does encompass like a wide variety of things.
So what a toddler might do to their parent while they're trying to feed them counts as an assault.
Sure, totally.
Okay.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I was looking through the numbers. It seems like the proportion of reported assaults that result in injury has stayed the same, even if like the number of reported assaults has gone higher.
Hmm.
So there's that. I also hear from incarcerated people a lot that corrections officer started something, got aggressive or something, and a scuffle ensues, and they write it up as an assault on staff. They write it up as the incarcerated person, like started something or was the aggressor. So I do see that all the time. So in terms of how trustworthy the data is, I think it could be both and. It could be very inflated. The trend could be correct while it's still inflated. It's really, really hard to say. But yeah, so that's another thread that led up to the strike. Both incarcerated people and corrections officers and, DOC's administration would say that there's a safety issue in New York State prisons. The question is, how do you address it? The corrections officers, they're a heterodox group, and I'm sure there's multifaceted opinions on this, but the line that's been coming out of the strike is one that you find safety through greater control. You find safety through repealing halts. You find safety through being able to arbitrarily punish and being able to put people in solitary confinement for indefinite amount of time and not having the requirements that they, be out of their cell or for a certain amount of time, or have like congregate group programming, which is another part of halts. Then there's like an alternative viewpoint that comes from incarcerated people. It comes from advocates. It actually comes from, I think, prison administration. Dan Marcello, the commissioner of DOCS, is behind a lot of proposals that sort of incentivize more of like a carrot approach than a stick approach. Things like increasing the amount of time you can earn off your sentence for good behavior, just improving prison conditions in general through programming, education classes, stuff that gives people a greater sense of purpose. Just making prison, one, better, and two, more of a place where you're incentivized to behave better because you might get your time off your sentence, to improve safety.
Well, you mentioned this idea that the prison guards are not some sort of monolith and they all might have different concerns. And given that backdrop, I want to note that in your reporting, you've highlighted the fact that less than a year ago, the prison guard union approved a new contract, and about three-quarters of the vote was in favor. But fast forward to today, is it your sense that NYSCOBA's actions, whether it's at the mediation table or the public posturing their take, is supported by a majority of its members? Because it seems like there might be regional factions that are emerging or other differing viewpoints, but I really can't tell how significant they are. Maybe you have a better sense of what the voices that NYSCOBA is speaking with and whether that is representative of a majority, a plurality, or maybe just a very small group of members.
Sure. No, I wish I had better reporting on this, but I will say it takes a level of cohesion to engage in a wildcat strike. I should mention, like, this is an unsanctioned strike. It's an illegal strike. Like, public employees aren't allowed to strike under New
Yeah, the
York
Taylor
law.
Law.
Yeah, and so NYSCOBA wasn't actually able to hold a vote like that, like you would for a traditional type of strike. It was a wildcat action, so I think, it does take a certain level of cohesion to be able to pull something off like that. I mean, it started in two prisons in Western New York, but it very quickly spread and hit almost every single one of New York's 42 prisons. So whatever factionalism exists, I'm sure it does, because that's just like when you have a political entity, there's going to be factions. They are sort of operating with yeah, like a some sort of unified voice. In terms of the contract that they just signed, I think that sort of speaks to how the issues underlying the strike are really one of guards' dissent with how the system operates and not so much with, what would be in their contract. Think issues like pay and stuff.
Mhm.
They want more action on understaffing, which means, big like systemic changes that, a union doesn't traditionally like bargain over. And they want to repeal the halt, which is a legislative action. So they're really like, I think in this strike, we usually think of strikes in the context of, collective bargaining agreement negotiations, but this is sort of the corrections officers acting as a political entity and going beyond, the traditional union action.
Do you have a sense then whether the NYSCOBA leadership will ultimately survive this experience? Do you anticipate there to be some sort of challenge to the leadership when there are votes scheduled, or maybe like over in Britain, they'll have some sort of snap election? What does the future leadership look like?
That's a great question. I haven't done a ton of reporting on that, and I wish I had more for you. Even though it wasn't like a NYSCOBA sanctioned strike, NYSCOBA and docs sat down with a mediator and we're talking, and NYSCOBA was the official spokesperson of the strike.
Wasn't that a de facto thing, though? I mean, what else are they going to do? Gather one
Totally.
representative from every prison?
Totally. And I think it just sort of that kind of like outlines how the Taylor law is only sort of effective insofar as it's effective. Like, if workers are going to go on strike, like, they're still going to go on strike. All I can really say about the future of NYSCOBA leadership is that there's a lot of dissatisfaction with where the mediation came out and with the agreement. It took a lot of threats from docs to get people back to work, even when there was a mediated agreement. After there was a media agreement, there was a couple hundred corrections officers who traveled to Albany and were
Right.
protesting outside of the Capitol. And from talking to, I'm mostly talking to retired corrections officers and a lot of people on the inside, it does seem like things are still extremely tense. So yeah, I'm not sure about like satisfaction or dissatisfaction with my scope of leadership, but I know there's a lot of dissatisfaction with where the strike supposedly ended.
Well, yeah, let's talk then about the mediation and the deal that was struck about a week ago. What should we know about what was included and how it's being implemented to date?
One thing that was, just a very concrete concession was a sort of added final straw before corrections officers went on strike was what they're like calling shorthand the 70-30 memo. So a week before they went on strike, Commissioner Marticello sent this memo addressing like we have staffing issues, we have staffing level issues. And it was to superintendents, and it pretty much said 70% staffing levels is the new 100% staffing levels. And just that idea and that quote really set corrections officers off, and I think is part of the reason that they struck when they did. So that's been rescinded. That's part of the mediation effort. There's a lot of like small stuff about reforming small quirks in how docs comes up with staffing and overtime and who is staffing and who should be forced to work overtime. During the strike, they increased the overtime rate to 2.5 pay, and they're keeping that in place, I think, for the time being. And then, one major thing that is a huge TBD still is it paused most facets of HALT for 90 days. There are some parts within the HALT solitary confinement law that allow for suspending it in emergency circumstances. And, Marticello is sort of pushing those to their limits. What happens after those 90 days is very unclear. Because if you try to alter this law, it takes action from the legislature. I know during the negotiations, there was a lot of everybody was saying the governor's office and their council is exploring what power she might have to suspend or amend or do various things to halt. I don't think she really has much power at all. It's part of the law. So it would take action from the legislature, and I think this mediated agreement puts a sort of pause on a lot of facets to halt, and it's unclear what's going to happen after those 3 months is up.
Well, you mentioned the legislature's role in this, and heading into the 2025 legislative session, there was some steam building up for progressive criminal justice reform, specifically in our state prisons, following the release of the video of the murder of Robert Brooks. Now, I don't think that reform necessarily has as much oomph behind it. And if there is going to be any sort of reform, it's going to have to be more comprehensive and probably take into consideration more of the prison guards' point of view. What's your sense of what's possible legislatively moving forward? I mean, do you think that there can be the same sort of emphasis that advocates like Julia Salazar in the state Senate were pushing in January?
That's a really great question, and I can see it going in either direction. There are different kinds of criminal justice reform when it relates to prisons. HALT is one kind. That's on one end. Another end is about like how much time you're spending in prison. And the big campaign push now is really focused on sentencing reform. This is kind of what I was talking about earlier in terms of the sort of carrot approach to making conditions inside prisons better. So people who are pushing those laws are actually arguing that it should be a point of consensus among corrections officers who are striking or who were striking and people who are very critical of that strike. How do you solve a staffing crisis? You get people out of prison. You get people out of prison quicker, you lower the population. That's their pitch.
That's not a good pitch. It's not a good pitch for the reality that we live in.
What do you
And
mean by the reality?
Well, the reality is that anything that might be perceived, rightly or wrongly, as being weak on crime or pro people with a criminal record is not going to have much traction in Albany, where Republicans will be opposed, as they generally always are, and moderate Democrats will likely be opposed given the political climate and the experience of recent elections, at least nationally or on the statewide level. I also think about this as an oxygen in the room situation where there might only be enough oxygen for one progressive criminal justice priority to survive, and if a wide range of proposals, like all the ones that you're thinking about, are pushed, they will all die. So it seems like for anything to get done, it needs to be targeted to the prison space, where it's still hard to forget about the murder of Robert Brooks or the more recent suspicious death also in central New York. And even then, we're likely talking about doing something in the context of the budget, and a standalone bill probably couldn't get to the finish line unless maybe the governor was championing it as a major priority of hers.
I mean, you hit on something that I haven't really mentioned or thought much about, but is yeah, just like legislative bandwidth. If all the parties were to like sit at the table for like a month and sort of talk through all of this, I can absolutely see a world where sentencing reform is a huge part of the conversation, and there's like, convincing, yeah, sort of those like tough on crime reactives that it actually helps the corrections officers and stuff like that. But that's not what's going to happen because there's a 6-month legislative window in New York, and most of it's eaten up by the budget. And what is actually makes it to be part of the conversation is a whole other question. I truly don't know what the legislative response is going to look like, especially, since the executive budget has already come out and you were really deep in budget season. Yeah, very unclear to me, but that's the pitch coming from the progressive side, and whether it happens this year or next year or never is, yeah, I guess we'll see.
Is there any reason to think that this is the last we've heard of the concerns about HALT? I mean, we seem to have some sort of kind of return to normalcy, or at least a new normal when it comes to prison guards and striking and staffing levels. So is there reason to think that we can proceed along this new pathway, or in 90 days when HALT is either being implemented again or it's being put on pause again for another 90 days? What do you see as the future of this issue?
I think there's absolutely no way that we can assume that we've hit a stasis or that this won't come up again. Yeah, one, because you mentioned the sort of the halt pause is only 90 days long, but also I think even though most corrections officers are back at work, just the descriptions that I'm hearing, especially from incarcerated people, but also just like seeing a lot of online stuff from COs and their families. The prisons are still a tinderbox. It's very tense. We just saw officers allegedly beat someone to death on Saturday. I don't think that's coincidental. And just yeah, just from what I'm hearing from incarcerated people, it's extremely tense. The National Guard is still
Yeah.
inside. Who knows like what happens when they leave? But it all still feels very tense. There will be future negotiations, I would think, with whoever is representing the corrections officers at the table.
And not to be craven about it, but it seems like these deaths, especially if they're caught on camera, or like in the case of the New York Times reporting, enough people are willing to go on the record about it. That's really the only way to move the needle in terms of making progressive criminal reforms happen in Albany. At least that's my really cynical perspective. But you mentioned the online conversation, and I've heard that there are like Reddit groups and all sorts of like chats. Are you able to access all this and find all this? And is this a useful way to try to take the temperature of prison guards around the state for you?
A little bit I'm able to access it. A lot of it happens behind private Facebook groups, which I have not yet been able to figure out. But yes, I do think it is a good thermometer, if you will, especially because the corrections officers have been pretty disciplined in not speaking to the press. They've had family members speak to the press on their behalf, and union officials will speak to the press, but it's hard to get exactly what they're thinking and gauge the sort of like heterodoxy that we were talking about and how that plays into things. But yeah, totally. They're always talking to each other, and there's much to be learned from what they're saying online.
When you try to make connections with either current prison guards or, like you said, retired prison guards, do you find that you're able to get people who are willing to talk to you on the record or even anonymously? And I know that's difficult enough for the media generally, but coming from New York Focus, which fairly or unfairly could be perceived as having a progressive slant to its reporting, does that make it even more difficult to do this, given how conservative some of these guards can be?
That's a really good question. That's a good Media 101 question. I mean, yes, in a certain way, I think it does make things difficult. In other ways, it kind of helps because, I write about Halt quite a bit, and they want their point of view out there. So I actually get a lot of emails from recently retired corrections officers who want to explain sort of like the realities and the usefulness of solitary confinement and just like isolation in general. And I'm very down to hear all of that. And I very much welcome their anecdotes and their perspective and their explanations on that. Just speaking particularly about New York Focus, we sort of attack systems from all angles. And I know that Commissioner Daniel Marticello is pretty unpopular among the staff right now.
That's a kind way to put it, yes.
I mean, take this with a grain of salt because he's the head of a sprawling carceral system, but he's a sort of like pseudo progressive in his own right. At least as progressive as you can expect from someone in that position. And yeah, we've done a lot of reporting on him and his family and sort of the patronage network that he came up in that articulates a lot of like nepotism and borderline corruption within docs that a lot of corrections officers, I mean, it's not sort of at the center of the current moment or like why they went on strike, but that's a huge complaint that they have too. So there's a little bit of room for connection there and talking about the tough issues while articulating the problems within the system itself.
We didn't get to it, but because you mentioned it, let me plug the really deep dive you did into Daniel Marticello. I highly recommend listeners check out the New York Focus piece on him and his family and their extensive ties within docs. And you can find that article at nysfocus.com. And if you aren't a deep dive kind of reader, they also have a much shorter, more condensed analysis of it as well. But that's all the time we have for this conversation. We've been speaking with Chris Gelardi. He's one of the leading reporters on all things prisons, and he works for New York Focus. Chris, thank you so much for spending the time, and I look forward to chatting with you more in the future.
Thanks so much, David. It was really great.
And if you're enjoying listening to Dispatches from Planet Albany, please leave us a rating and review wherever you get the podcast. It helps other political nerds find the show and gives me a little boost of serotonin every time I see a new star or positive review. And finally, if you are an energy-crazed listener in the Capital Region, you might want to check out the panel I am hosting on March 25th as part of the Independent Power Producers of New York's annual Spring Conference. I will be leading a chat about artificial intelligence, large loads, and economic development here in New York. Until next time, podcast adjourned.
And I got to tell you, I've had this bill for 6 years, and I think the time has come. It's time to split this state. 3 autonomous regions. Give us our autonomy.
Mr. DiPietro, can you speak on the bill, please?
I am speaking on the bill. Autonomous regions. We don't want this. The rest of the state doesn't want this. I'm talking about the bill, Madam Speaker. We don't want it. We want to split the state. Let us on our own. We'll be redder than Texas overnight.
Madam
the jobs
Speaker,
will flow in. And this is because of this. It's going to bankrupt people and cause people to move more out of the state than they already are. We've already lost in 5 years approximately 1.5 million people since right before COVID. It's a travesty.
Ms. People-Stokes, why do you stand?
Madam Speaker, I would ask if you could again remind my colleague that he should stay on the bill before us.
I'm on the bill,
today.
Mrs. Stokes. I'm talking about the impacts of this bill.
Sir, if you were on the bill, you wouldn't be mentioning corrections and people leaving the state and all the rest of those things. You'd be speaking specifically to the bill.
I am on the bill. Thank you.